Everyone, and thank you for joining us today at the Employee Benefit Research Institute's virtual 87th Policy Forum. I'm Lori Lucas, President and CEO of EBRI. And before I turn over today to our Master of Ceremonies, Liz Varley of Ameriprise Financial Services, I want to set the stage for the third in our four-part series of one-hour sessions. The theme of this policy forum is COVID-19's impact. Its impact on American workers' retirement security, on defined benefit plans, the employer-based healthcare system, and employer approaches to financial wellness. It is clearly unprecedented times, and this has made me think back on other unprecedented events I've seen in my life. Does anyone remember the New York transit strike of 1980? 35,000 transit workers walked out for 11 days, shutting down much of New York City. It tested the resourcefulness, patience, and sanity of more than 3 million subway and bus riders. One example of resourcefulness is that because women had to walk miles to work, they took to wearing gym shoes on the street and then changed into high heels when they got into the office. It turned out that that was a welcome change, and many continue that practice to this day. I'm sure there will be long-term impacts, both large and small, of the current crisis. And that's what we're here to talk about this week in the realm of workplace wellness and benefits. Today, we'll hear about coming out the other side of COVID-19, the future of the employer-based healthcare system. Liz will cover the full agenda, but before we get started, I wanted to thank Liz for spearheading the development of this very unusual policy forum in her role as Vice Chair of the EBRI Public Policy Advisory Council, along with the PPAC members whose names you see on this slide. If you'd like to join the Public Policy Advisory Council, please reach out to Betsy Jaffe for more information. I will now turn it over to Liz Varley to cover the agenda and to introduce today's speakers. Liz?
Great, thank you, Lori, and thanks for everybody for joining us. As Lori indicated, we're on day 3 of our policy forum, and we are going to turn our attention to healthcare. Employer-based healthcare benefits are provided to about 49% of the U.S. population. So we wanted to provide an opportunity to bring in some experts to talk about what is top of mind for employers, bring their best thinking as we look ahead to dealing with COVID-19, the 2020 election, and the future of workplace benefits. Before I introduce the panel, I want to turn to a couple housekeeping items. First, meeting materials, including the presentations, are available on the EBRI Policy Forum webpage. If you can't find them, just email us at info@ebri.org, and they will be sent to you. To ask a question, please click on the chat button at the bottom of the screen and type your question into the chat box. Your question will be seen by all panelists. If you're dialing in without a Zoom connection, you can email your questions to info@ebri.org, and we'll try and get to them real time during the meeting. Attendees can also raise your hand, and we will contact you through the chat window. This is a large group, so please keep yourself on mute throughout the meeting. Now let me introduce today's panel. We're going to be led by John Kessler, President and CEO of HealthEquity. John's been President of HealthEquity since 2009, and he's also the founder of WageWorks, and let me say I am a big fan. He's going to be joined by Paul Fronstin, who's the Director of Health Research and Education Programs for EBRI. He's been with EBRI since 1993. Paul is joined on our panel by Kurt Giesa. Kurt is a partner with Oliver Wyman. He's based in Wisconsin, and he works with employers, regulators, and providers to address healthcare reform requirements. We will also hear from Heather Meade. Heather is a principal with Washington Council Ernst & Young here in Washington, D.C. She's a healthcare policy expert. She provides support to clients to advocate and educate policymakers both on Capitol Hill and in the regulatory agencies. Their full bios are available on the EBRI Policy Forum webpage. Thanks again to all of you for all your work in getting us to today's panel, and let me turn it over to John.
Thank you, Liz, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'll try and be brief in the parade of introductions and then get to the panelists. These are really interesting items. Paul is going to discuss the evolution of the employer's business case for providing health coverage to employees. As As was mentioned, employers cover about half of all Americans, and our system is entirely voluntary. So understanding the business case and how it is changing and how COVID-19 may change it further is extremely important. Kurt is going to share his team's findings, which I found extremely interesting, on how the recent wave of unemployment is likely to change the source of health insurance coverage for individuals and families, especially as we go into open enrollment for 2021. And then Heather will share insights on what employers are thinking now, a new employer alliance, and also some research on what voter perceptions could mean for the future of employer-provided health coverage. As was mentioned, please keep questions, please fire away on the questions, whether through the app or through email. We want to hear from you, and your questions are going to be better than ours, or better than mine, certainly. So with that, I will throw to Paul to get us started. Paul?
Thanks, John. Also want to thank everybody for tuning in to our forum panel and for your interest in the work we do at EBRI. I'd like to start off with a polling question. If we could bring up the polling question, please. The question is, which of the following statements, or please choose a statement that best characterizes your company's strategy relating to health benefits for active employees over the next 10 years? You could choose from the following options. First, continue offering employment-based defined benefit health plans as we do today. Second, give serious consideration to moving to a defined contribution strategy. Third, give serious consideration to discontinuing providing health care benefits. And fourth, not sure. If you're not an employer, you should still feel free to give serious consideration to this question in the 10 to 15 seconds that you have to answer it, and then we'll look at the responses. Okay, if we could bring up the responses, please. So a little over half will see themselves continuing the health benefits, basically the defined benefit health plans that we have today. 16% giving serious consideration to moving to a defined contribution strategy. 5% serious consideration to discontinuing providing health care benefits, and 23% not sure. The 23% may be the most honest answer. On the next slide, you're going to see the results from the same survey from almost 10 years ago, from 2011. This survey was conducted among chief human resource officers from mostly Fortune 500 companies. They were asked the same exact question. 6% said they were giving serious consideration to dropping coverage, so not much different. In fact, the numbers, I think the only real difference between your answers and what we saw 10 years ago was today there are fewer of you giving serious consideration to moving to a defined contribution strategy and more of you saying you're not sure. It's interesting that 10 years ago, I thought the headline was the 6% that said they were giving serious consideration to dropping coverage. I think anytime you have one employer, one large employer, saying that they were thinking about that, that would be a headline. But it wasn't the headline. The headline at the time was the 36% that were considering moving to a defined contribution strategy. And for the most part, that hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened? Well, on the next slide, I'm going to give you a brief history lesson. John said I'm going to give you the evolution of the business case for health benefits, and just, I'm going to boil down this evolution to just a few minutes. There's a lot to cover here, but in the interest of time, let me get right to the bottom line. And that is, employers started offering health benefits and continue to do so for business reasons. They do so to recruit and retain workers, especially when unemployment is low. They do so because of their concern about employee health, especially as it relates to productivity. And they think that they are more efficient or better at offering health benefits than the government would be. Otherwise, they would support switching their premium payments for taxes and moving to Medicare for all or something like that. On the next slide, you can see one of my favorite surveys. This is a survey that's been done annually for the past decade. It dates back to 2004. In the survey, employers, and again, this is mostly large employers, they're asked whether they are confident that they will be offering health benefits 10 years from now or 10 years from when the survey was fielded. So in 2008, 73% of employers said they were confident that they'd be offering health benefits by 2018. 10 years ago, 57% of employers were confident they'd be offering health benefits today. And as you could see last year in 2019, 74% of employers said they were confident they would be offering health benefits in 2029. And this has been trending up since 2014 and is now being last year, the most recent year we have data for, at a record high. And it's been interesting to see the ebb and flow of the answers to this question. As we went into the last recession, you see the numbers going, the confidence levels going down. You could see post passage of the ACA, the numbers bottoming out, and then it's been on this upward trajectory since then. Why have we seen this? On the next slide, basically here's what's been happening since the passage of the ACA, Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, depending upon what you know it as. The unemployment rate's been falling. In 2010, the year the ACA passed, just coming out of the last recession, the unemployment rate was, it peaked at 10%, a little bit over 10%. And by last year, it was down to 4%. So you see this basically straight line down. It shouldn't be a surprise that employers didn't move to defined contribution health benefits and didn't stop offering health benefits. They have become increasingly concerned about recruitment and retention of their workers. They felt they needed to offer health benefits to operate their businesses successfully. Where we are today, well, let's just move on to the next slide. As you know, since mid-March, over 40 million workers have filed for unemployment insurance, resulting in an unemployment rate that went from less than 4% last year and early this year to over 14% overnight. This picture raises the question as to whether employers need to offer health benefits anymore. On the next slide, I note that the recession that we're in today is different from every recession the U.S. economy has ever experienced. It's the first time in history that we've had a recession when workers, employers, the unemployed, et cetera, have an alternative to employment-based health benefits. Workers no longer need their employer for health insurance. Because of insurance market reforms tied to the availability of ACA health insurance exchanges, workers can go to an exchange and not be denied coverage for a pre-existing condition. Premiums are the same whether or not they have health conditions or pre-existing conditions. They get premium subsidies if they're low income. They get cost-sharing subsidies if they're low income. They get a lot more health plan choices than they would get from an employer, with the exception being the Federal Employees Health Benefits Program, which offers 200 health plans nationwide, and I think on average each federal employee has about 20 health plans to choose from. How many of the non-federal employees that are paying attention to this webinar have 20 health plans to choose from? They get a lot more health plan choices, and it's also the first time in history that a recession was not only combined with insurance market reforms, but with a way to give workers pre-tax income to purchase health insurance on their own via health reimbursement arrangements. So we have high unemployment, which means some employers might be thinking they don't need to offer coverage anymore. We have insurance market reforms. We have a way to give workers pre-tax income to purchase health insurance. The obvious question then to me is, will employers drop coverage? Next slide. Am I predicting that employers will drop coverage? I'm not. Please don't walk away from this thinking that I'm predicting employers are going to stop offering health benefits. I'm an economist. I would note that predictions are very easy for economists to make, but predictions are much harder to get right, especially if you're an economist like me. Next slide. So instead of making some random guess about what might happen to employment-based coverage, we set out to better understand what employers might do. We are embarking on a project that interviews benefit directors, VPs of HR, and others who represent the employer community to get some intelligence on what employers are thinking right now. The study's focused on mid-sized and large employers as they are often trendsetters. So it may not be a representative sample that we're interviewing, which is always risky. But trends tend to start with small numbers. Large employers and mid-sized employers are often the leaders of those trends. They're often the early adopters, and it only takes one. It only takes one employer to go out on a limb and say, we're going to stop offering health benefits. And if that happens, you might see others follow. We're not doing a survey. Instead, we're conducting in-depth interviews since we don't think it is as simple as conducting a survey. The biggest limitation with our study is that most employers like to keep to themselves. There are 6 million employers in the U.S. Most aren't members of EBRI. Most aren't members of regional business groups on health. They don't interact with us. They don't interact with others. It's hard to collect their views. And we don't know to what degree those who don't interact may be the trendsetters. So that's a risk. The next slide, I would just note we're in the middle of this project. We don't have a paper yet. We haven't even finished our interviews yet. We've barely gotten started, but I wanted to share with you some of the things we're hearing. So far, no discussion whatsoever of cutting or dropping health benefits since mid-March. Otherwise, you're hearing about things like furloughs, salary decreases, cuts to 401k matches, cuts to gym memberships. Everything is on the table except health benefits, and that may be because healthcare is too emotionally charged of an issue right now to be on the table. We've heard that management generally accepts 5% yearly increases in premiums without any pushback. We've heard that there might be opportunities for provider payment reform, prescription pricing, and other purchasing strategies. Some of the interviews we've done, we've heard that employers might be rethinking or might start to rethink their telemedicine strategy in the sense that traditional third-party telemedicine vendors might go away or may be de-emphasized as everyone else's providers have gotten online with telemedicine basically overnight. There's no urgency to reevaluate benefit design. There's general skepticism of Medicare for all, but some openness to Medicare buy-in. There's no interest in the individual health reimbursement arrangements. There's concern about extended COBRA eligibility period. And among some of those employers we spoke to with a low take-up rate, such as restaurants, they actually think they would pay more if they drop coverage because so few people take coverage and they wind up paying the $2,000 shared responsibility penalty for everybody. Next slide. And just a couple other things that we've learned. Even with high unemployment, health benefits is still viewed as a recruitment and retention tool. Only non-gold standard employers would consider dropping coverage. They are considering dropping spousal coverage, and they're rethinking high deductible health plans. I think they're concerned about the fact that we're in a health situation and what that may mean for their employees. They're considering dropping very costly specialty medications. There's no consensus opinion about the role of employers, individuals, or government. We did ask about this, but there is some openness to reform. We did hear that they would consider dropping coverage if others dropped, but nobody who we interviewed is willing to be first. And at this point, employers still feel that they're in crisis management mode. They're just not thinking yet about the long term. So we're going to spend the summer continuing to interview employers. We plan to write up what we learn and publish our findings in an EBRI issue brief later this fall. Thank you again for your interest in our work. Look forward to hearing your questions. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Kurt.
Kurt, you're up. 10 minutes. Nicely done, Paul.
Yeah, Paul, thanks very much. Thanks for having me here today. And for those in the audience, thanks for your attention. I'll be sharing some results from our modeling efforts, projecting the impact of differing unemployment scenarios on insurance markets and sources of insurance coverage. I'll start with a couple of background slides. Then I've got a couple of slides that describe the characteristics of the recently unemployed. And I hope these slides will be helpful to you in understanding our modeling results, as they may seem a little counterintuitive at times. I'll then describe the modeling we've done and show you the results. And finally, I'll provide a couple of slides showing what we actually know about what's been happening in the market. It's very preliminary, but something we're keeping track of. one large caveat before I start with this. I'm sure, perhaps you've heard the expression. This is kind of in keeping with Paul's comment, but all models are wrong. Some are useful, and the modeling we're doing here, I'm certain is wrong. This is a complex thing, difficult to model. But I hope the results that we share with you are interesting and useful. So on the next slide, what we show is, so not the background slide, but the slide, yeah. What we show here is the fact that jobless claims have not been occurring among industries equally. We had about 5 million unemployment claims per week for the last 2 weeks in March and the first 2 weeks in April, but job loss wasn't spread across industries equally. And the jobs reports that have come out since show this trend continues. During the month of April, almost half the people working in leisure and hospitality lost their jobs. And there were large job losses in arts and entertainment, mining and retail trades, manufacturing, education. You can see the industries that have been most impacted. And we think that's important in what the future might hold as far as sources of coverage for individuals under unemployment scenarios. You can see that there was also a lot of job loss from office-based healthcare providers, for example, primary care physicians and dentists. The point I really want to take away from this is, again, the job loss isn't impacting all industries equally. And that has important consequences for insurance markets. In particular, in our modeling, if the unemployed are coming primarily from industries with low wages, where employers are unlikely to be offering coverage and where employee take-up rates are low, that has important implications. A lot of those individuals don't increase the number of uninsured when they lose their jobs. They weren't insured to begin with. And we also have a lot of those individuals losing jobs being eligible for Medicaid coverage in states that expanded Medicaid. And on the next slide, we show unemployment rates by state with the unemployment rate along the x-axis and the size of the bubbles, the number of uninsured in the state in the most recent jobs report. We've grouped these states into expansion and non-expansion states. So those states that expanded eligibility to Medicaid so that people with below 138% of the poverty level have access to or are eligible for Medicaid in non-expansion states. What's important here is if you're in an expansion state and you lose your job and have no household income, you're almost automatically eligible for Medicaid. If you're in a state that didn't expand Medicaid, though, there's a pretty good chance you're not going to get access to Medicaid coverage. As an example, if you're a childless adult in Florida and Texas, there is no Medicaid option for you. As a note, about 70% of people losing their jobs live in an expansion state. And that serves as a powerful brake on the number of uninsured resulting from the job loss we've seen. On the next slide, we show a couple of descriptive statistics, actually the slide after this one. This slide shows the number of people employed by industry, and it splits the employment into small group, mid-sized group, and large group. Note that accommodation and food service, that's about 14 million workers. Retail trade is about 16 million workers. And healthcare and social assistance is about 20 million workers. And these are the industries that have been particularly hard hit by COVID-19. On the next slide, we go into this a little more detail here. In this slide, what we show is the average income by industry grouping. And in the modeling results I'll share in a second, we draw the unemployed in 2021 primarily from the industries that are in green and the red bars. And you can see that these industries tend to have pretty low average incomes, and with the exception of mining and gas, but I really didn't concentrate on this prior slide, but there aren't a lot of people in mining gas. So the industries where the people are, for example, accommodation, food services, retail trade, healthcare, social assistance, in those industries, incomes are relatively low. So again, in the scenarios I'll be sharing with you, when these people lose their jobs and they are covered by unemployment benefits, they're often eligible for Medicaid, and again, this has consequences for how the coverage, sources of coverage for individuals. On the next slide, we show offer rates on the left-hand side and take-up rates conditional on an offer rate on the right-hand side. And you can see almost all large employers are offering health benefits, but only 47% of the small employers, those with less than 50 employees, are offering health benefits. And those taking up health benefits is a pretty small percentage. You can see on the right-hand side in the chart. Depending on industry, it varies, but in total, we've only got just over half the people being offered health benefits taking up health benefits. You put those two things together, and the number of people that are covered, particularly in something like small employer retail trade, is pretty small. You can take half the people offering, half taking it up, and you'll have only about a quarter of the people in the retail trade being covered by employer-sponsored coverage to begin with. So on the next slide, the slide after this, what we've been thinking about is really three scenarios. This is what we've been working with clients on. And as a little context, unemployment was 25% in 1933 when FDR put through the New Deal. That's the highest it's ever been since BLS has been keeping statistics. And it stayed actually well above 10% through 1941 in Pearl Harbor. It was 10%, as Paul said, in 2009 during the depth of the financial crisis. So where are we now? The most recent jobs loss report shows unemployment at about 13%. The last time it was that high was 1939. And the really incredible thing is that we went from 3.5% to 13% over the course of about a month. So there's a little context. With respect to the scenarios we've been thinking about, you may have seen a survey that was done by the Washington Post where about 80% of people laid off and furloughed expected to get their jobs back once the pandemic was past us. That would mean we'd have about 4 or 5 million people who'd been laid off or furloughed remaining unemployed. And that's the sort of outcome we're modeling in this first scenario. So a rebound in the second half of 2020. And in total, about 5 million people more unemployed than we had pre-COVID. The second scenario, as I said, we're at 13% now. It's pretty much, things stay the way they are now. The third scenario we modeled, the 18% unemployment, assumes that we really have a severe recession. It continues into 2021. And as I said, it's considerably lower than during the Depression, but much higher than we are now with our 13%. In each of the scenarios, we varied the industries we considered for unemployment. In scenario 2, the one I'll be sharing most of the results with you, what we assumed was that the industries most impacted would be small and mid-size employers in the industries mining, retail trade, transportation, accommodations, food, healthcare, social assistance, educational services. We assumed that most of the unemployed would come from those industries. For unemployment benefits, so those people losing jobs, what we assumed they would be, we modeled this at the state level based on state-specific unemployment benefits, but we assumed that we'd be essentially replacing about 50% of prior wages for up to 26 weeks plus an additional 13 weeks. What that works out to is about 3/8 of annual wages. And this really is important, particularly given the industries we're talking about. In an expansion state where Medicaid eligible is up to 138% of FPL, anyone who made less than about $46,000 a year would qualify for Medicaid with their employment benefits. In a non-expansion state like Texas or Florida, again, the working age adults without dependents wouldn't be eligible for Medicaid. There is no Medicaid for that kind of people. But the point here is for a lot of people receiving unemployment benefits, unemployed, Medicaid will be a powerful backstop. On the next slide, this is the last background slide I have. We assume that the unemployed would come primarily from the private sector employers, not from government. We took into account state-specific eligibility criteria for Medicaid and for unemployment benefits, so on and so forth. I won't go through all these, but we did model things on a nationwide basis using state-specific inputs. So on the next slide, what we show here is the change in the ACA individual market. As Paul was saying, this is the first time we're really going through a recession when we have access to strong subsidies for individuals, for low-income individuals. And this is guarantee issue, so anybody who needs coverage can access coverage through this market. But you'll see here what we're showing is very little change in the number of people covered in the individual market in 2021 compared to our baseline under the first two scenarios where we're assuming that we're drawing primarily from those low-income industries or industries where people have relatively low incomes. And what's happening here is there are people who are moving out of the ACA market because they are qualifying for Medicaid, for example, and people who are moving in from the employer market. And we'll show this a little more clearly on the next slide. On slide 34. So
hey, Dan,
please.
I'm sorry, Kurt, I promised to crack the whip, so you got about 3 more minutes.
That's perfect. I'll be done here, hopefully then. I'll just orient you here quickly. We refer to this as a transition matrix. The column at the left shows our baseline scenario. That's under pre-COVID unemployment. And the row at the bottom shows results under the scenario we're testing. And this, we're doing our middle scenario here, where we've got about 14 million people losing employer-based coverage. You can see, for example, we're showing 105.2 million people with employer-based coverage under our baseline scenario. And that excludes government workers primarily, and that's why it's not higher. But we show 105.2 million people with ESI coverage. And we've got 14 million people losing their jobs. And you can see what happens. We've got about 1 million people moving into the ACA. So they're getting coverage in the individual market. We've got about 1.1 million people becoming uninsured. So those are people who, primarily in expansion states, get unemployment benefits and don't qualify for subsidies because their income is too low. And then we've got about 2.2 million people who become eligible for Medicaid coverage. Again, Medicaid provides a pretty powerful backstop. What we're not showing here is the fact that about 4.3 million people that makes up about 4.3 million people, I'm sorry. What we're not showing is that about 4 million people were uninsured before they lost their employer lost their jobs, and so those people stayed uninsured. There was no change there, or they found access inside the ACA markets. And about 6 million people get coverage in our modeling through a spouse who has employer-sponsored coverage. So bottom line, we're not showing a lot of movements among the market. Medicaid grows. The ACA picks up a few members, but the number of uninsured actually shrinks as people who had been uninsured become eligible for Medicaid through Medicaid expansion or become eligible for ACA subsidies. So kind of a counterintuitive result, but we're showing that the ACA really is providing a powerful backstop under this unemployment scenario to large growth in the uninsured. One thing to note here, we are showing Medicaid eligibles as being insured or not uninsured. I think that's different. But now, in kind of keeping with this idea that all models are wrong, some are useful, we've been tracking what's happening. On the next slide, what's happening in kind of real time. On the next slide, we show as best we can what's happening in the ACA market, what kind of growth we're seeing there. And this is the number of people who are coming in through special enrollment periods. We had 258,000 individuals enrolled in the ACA, who enrolled in the ACA in April and May. That's 121,000 more than had enrolled in April and May in 2019. So in 2020, we were seeing more people coming into the ACA through a special enrollment period because they lost job-based coverage. So we're seeing growth in the ACA market, but it's not explosive growth by any stretch as a result of the job loss. And you can see there may be a lag here, but the SEP coverage grew primarily in April, or grew most in April, less in May. Jobless claims were highest in April, smaller in May. So, while there may be a lag, it does seem like the lag might not be that strong. So that was kind of one data point. The next data point I wanted to provide is on the next slide. And this shows the growth in Medicaid enrollment in those states that we have reports for. The change in Medicaid enrollment between the first and second quarter 2020. And Medicaid's been growing. Medicaid grew by about 4%, well, actually between 3 and 4% in the states where there's this reporting. So Medicaid is serving as a backdrop, and it grew 4% in expansion states, 2% in non-expansion states. Again, there may be a bit of a lag here between when people get laid off and when they sign up for Medicaid. But Medicaid is proving to be a pretty powerful backstop to the increase in the uninsured rates. So those were the slides I wanted to share with you.
Thank you, Kurt. Awesome. We've got some celebrity questions coming in. We want more. So Heather, you're up, and please, everyone, submit your questions.
Great. Thanks so much, John. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the context in which we are seeing employers, Congress, and the public respond to the pandemic with respect to employer-provided health care. So on the next slide, you can see, Congress has responded to this pandemic with, a number of really sort of targeted policies that really reflected their thinking based on where we were in those, moments of pandemic. And they've addressed employer-provided healthcare in very narrow, targeted ways. We've seen a little bit of, mandatory coverage of some items. We have seen them take dollars and allow the PPP funds to be utilized for providing healthcare coverage. That was not without, political pressure required to do that. And we've also seen some additional support through the employee retention tax credit, but again, difficult and limited. As we've moved through those packages, Congress is just now taking a look at sort of the political and voting dynamics that they are seeing as they go back home for the 4th of July recess coming up before they come back and make decisions about their next package. The package that the House produced is not going to move through the Senate, but it actually included a much more robust response to the question of how we continue to provide health care in a pandemic that is actually much more reflective of how voters feel. Maybe not as reflective of the data as Kurt showed us, but certainly is more reflective of how voters feel and are responding on a bipartisan basis. So I want to move to the next slide, but we're going to walk through some of those responses in order to gather sort of a fuller picture of how voters are responding. Employers, I think exactly as Paul mentioned in his first slides, I think the right word for employer-provided health coverage in this environment has been uncertainty. We came into this with a real level of uncertainty about what it would mean from a cost perspective for plans, what kind of cuts and furloughs would be required. And that, as we've gained a greater understanding of what that looks like over the past months, we've really moved from sort of the immediate emergency of uncertainty, where we've started to gain a little bit more insight into what our immediate costs might look like, with still questions about our future costs, to really focusing on some of the benefit design pieces that have been really, really critical during the pandemic, such as access to mental health care, has become such a huge priority for employers. Congress is looking at this as well. The same with telehealth. What kind of regulations are needed to maintain this, and will Congress do anything about that as part of these packages? It's been a really crucial tool for employers. The next piece that we're really, seeing this big focus on is sort of a question. We asked a lot of questions at the beginning about, will you be offering benefits? But I also think there's a question that we're hearing a lot amongst employer, which is, which benefits are you going to be offering? And are they going to be the same ones? Is your workforce returning to the same place? Are they not? And will they be valuing the same benefits? And so that's another question that we've certainly seen employers grappling with over the past couple of months. Some of the other things that have made this environment a lot more challenging are some of the actions that have been undertaken by the administration as they were trying to help, some helpful, some less helpful, as they were trying to help provide coverage to individuals who have lost their coverage. One of those that we'll talk a little bit more about is COBRA coverage. The administration, as everyone here knows, made efforts to allow more people to enroll in COBRA coverage. As a recovering ERISA lawyer, I know that for HR people, COBRA is a bad word just because it is so difficult to manage from a cost and enrollment perspective. But it really is sort of this, remaining tool that remained in place for employer-provided coverage. And there's sort of two pieces there that I want to dig into a little bit more after this on a policy perspective. So I'm going to flag that for future slides. But these are really some of the main things that we're hearing sort of rise up from employers and that are also top of mind for policymakers as we move into the next package. Next slide, please. The public, on the other hand, has had a little less of a nuanced response. The response from the public has been surprisingly uniform, and we've seen some pretty significant shifts in the polling that have actually continued even as some of the data that Kurt provided has actually provided more I think, security for those that are working in benefits. There is still a really strong feeling of insecurity about healthcare that's resonating in the public. Pretty early on during the pandemic, we saw this through a lot of the op-eds that came out, and there were two very diverse responses on both the political right and the political left, neither of which included employer-provided coverage as a solution in the pandemic. And I think it's a reflection point for employers to think about. We saw those on the left move very, very quickly to supporting, to using this as an opportunity to support Medicare for all and to highlight how employer-provided coverage was not a solution in a economic and healthcare pandemic. And we saw a lot of very high-profile op-eds. On the right, we saw the same argument, but fashioned a little bit differently. What we saw were a lot of arguments that employer-provided coverage is not a solution in an economic and healthcare pandemic, but instead they recommended moving everybody into the individual market and providing pandemic accounts that would be much like the HSA paired with a super high deductible health plan. And so both sort of ends of the political spectrum moved away from employer-provided coverage as a policy solution for providing coverage to Americans. On the next slide, we also saw the same action happen in voter response. This is actually an older slide that showed that there was a real from April when the big unemployment numbers were coming out. And you can see here that there was a really significant increase in the number of Americans that are supporting a Medicare for all health plan, and specifically a type of proposal that would exclude employer-provided coverage. One of the things that was most interesting about the subdata in this was that some of the largest increases were actually amongst Republican voters and small business owners who were also Republicans, because they were feeling the pressure of the inability to maintain employer-provided health coverage during the pandemic. And so we actually thought we would start to see this trend decrease about this point in time. That hasn't happened yet. And voter support for very significant government intervention remains particularly high on a bipartisan basis. I think this is another important sort of reflection point for employers as we think about how voters are viewing it and how Congress might react. Is this saying that, you know, as we've talked about on a lot of EBRI webcasts, does this change the overall political dynamics about, you know, the ability to move Medicare for all immediately on a national basis? No, probably not. But it is a very significant shift in voter sentiment, and particularly amongst Republicans. Next slide. So one of the things that they've asked me to share with you today is a little bit about the Alliance to Fight for Healthcare. One of the groups that I work with is the Alliance to Fight for Healthcare. This is a group of large employers, consumer groups, labor unions, healthcare companies, health insurers, that all came together in a few years ago to fight the Cadillac tax. They were very focused on the repeal of the Cadillac tax. At the end of the year, they had folded up shop, went home, washed their hands, gave a round of fist pumps, and left. But as the dialogue around Medicare for all and real concern about the value and role of employer-provided coverage started to increase on the Hill, this group came back together to focus on a variety of areas for supporting employer-provided coverage, rebranding as the Alliance to Fight for Healthcare. Next slide. The key policy goals that were established at the beginning were really to focus on the role of Americans, of providing healthcare to Americans and thinking about the system overall and making sure that we didn't have any large gaps, because those gaps in our system, as we saw during the passage of the ACA, can lead to a lot of upheaval and change in the healthcare system, some of which can be difficult for employer-provided plans to navigate. So the Alliance is supporting policies that keep Americans in coverage, support employers that are struggling to continue to provide coverage, enhance the availability and affordability of coverage, and also recognizing the role and challenges that we're facing providers, continuing to support our healthcare workers in the crisis. You can see on the next slide how these sort of moved into policies. This slide, I'm actually going to skip this slide and I'll just talk about it in a little bit of a minute. Some of the policy recommendations that specifically came out of this idea were targeted around, number one, making sure that employer-provided coverage is viewed as a meaningful source of coverage. So one of the top issues that I know has been a little bit controversial amongst employer groups is the providing subsidies for COBRA coverage. This was viewed as very important by the coalition, particularly in light of the administration's actions to mandate COBRA coverage can be elected up to 6 months after the pandemic ends in a retroactive fashion. By providing COBRA subsidies that ensures, particularly in states where you have individuals that are not eligible for Medicaid and are not eligible for exchange coverage, that individuals can stay in their COBRA coverage with a significant subsidy, which is intended to try and reduce some of the adverse selection that employers tend to see in COBRA elections overall. And so the Alliance has recommended a very significant subsidy of between 90 and 100% for individuals who have lost coverage, who might otherwise not have access to other sources of coverage. Some of the other items that the Alliance is working on are creating funding opportunities for some of the other activities that employers are having to pick up, such as, you know, PPE and keeping people healthy, providing premium support for employers that are struggling to make their premiums due to very significant losses in their businesses. We're very focused on telehealth and preserving the flexibility that employers need to provide telehealth, making sure that they don't institute mandatory payment rates as part of that, or prohibit some of the really interesting things that employers are doing now and already in telehealth. And also trying to help Congress think about making streamlined processes that don't add to sort of the significant burdens that employers face when Congress thinks of new and exciting policies for employers to take on. So it's been a really interesting process to sort of work through some of these on the Hill on a bipartisan basis. But we want to sort of flag some of these for you. On the next slide, if we can move forward.
All right, Heather, you're going to get the hook in a minute. You got to do it.
I know. On the next slide, we wanted to show a little bit of why the data about why the high subsidy is in there. There was some very interesting data that came out of GAO showing that you need the really high number of subsidy in order for it to be supported. This has been very well received on the Hill. And on the next slide, what I did want to share with you as sort of a final takeaway, as a reminder that, you know, while COBRA is not something that we always love as HR people, from a public perception, this was polling that was done in really early May. And we saw really, really strong support, 78% supporting government funding for COBRA continuation coverage. And really any sort of very significant support for employer-sponsored coverage. This is included amongst both Republicans and Democrats. Interestingly enough, this week I have seen newer polling that hasn't been released yet that shows that this number has actually grown significantly over the course. So even as we've seen a decrease in the number of sort of unemployment and the unemployment trend, we've actually seen an increase in support for the government taking significant action to support employer-sponsored plans. And more than half of Americans supporting any policy in this environment is pretty significant. And so just sentiment is really important for us to sort of keep an eye on, because it will dictate the kinds of actions that we see in Congress.
Okay, thank you.
Get back to you, John.
Awesome. We have a bunch of questions, really active dialogue. I'm going to start with one from, oh, you're hearing my dog. I'm going to start with one from the Oracle himself, Howard Fleur. If folks don't know who Howard is, they should, and can find out more at EBRI.org. But Howard asks, with all of the gig workers out there, essentially, it might be that the real unemployment number is 10% higher than is reported. And how does the presence of gig workers affect your findings? And I think that probably is best directed to Kirk.
You know, I guess what I would say, that's sort of similar to the way we've been thinking about the newly uninsured or the newly unemployed who were uninsured. So, you know, those individuals would have access to Medicaid if their incomes declined to an extent that, you know, they were below 138% of FPL in expansion states, and they'd probably enter the ranks of the uninsured if they weren't in an expansion state.
Cool, it's good we have it. A question that came from a number of folks, including Steve Wojcik, another star. There are data from the Kaiser Family Foundation and others that show that there is obviously been some uptick in support for Medicare expansion or Medicare for all, or what have you, but also that that uptick's been fairly modest and relative to where support might have been, let's say, a year ago, that it's actually down. So the question sort of is how should we interpret that data in light of your findings? And probably best goes to Heather.
They're not my findings. I think one of the things that has been most interesting in the data is we have seen sort of a general growth in interest overall. So compared over the last 20-year span, so compared to last year, the growth is not as significant. Where the growth was actually most significant was in the groups of Republicans who are supporting Medicare for all, which was a really sort of interesting trend that we weren't expecting to see such growth in that particular area. But it has sort of been bumping around in that low sort of 50 range in the last couple of years, which is a pretty significant growth from where it had been, maybe even just a decade ago.
So you're saying there's no atheists in a foxhole.
Really?
I'm going to take the next one. Boy, there's a lot of these. These are really good. One question, and I think maybe this best goes to Paul. So if Kurt's findings are correct, and we're going to see fairly substantial expansion in Medicaid,
John, you're going to have to start over. I couldn't hear you.
How do you think the states are going to pay for for all the new people on Medicaid?
I didn't hear the first part of your question. I heard the part about how the state's going to pay for the increase in Medicaid.
That's the one.
Thank you. And it's not going to be easy for them, but they're going to have to figure out a way to pay for lots of different things, given they're seeing their tax revenue fall, income tax revenue, perhaps sales tax revenue too. They're dealing with pension funding crises, and they'll be dealing with Medicaid too. When you look at the Medicaid numbers, I'm not sure how significant the 5 million, right, Kurt? It looked like it was an increase in 5 million in enrollment. I don't know how significant that is, simply because who is it that's signing up for Medicaid when you spread those 5 million across 50 states? Are those only people that use a lot of healthcare services, and that's why they're signing up for Medicaid? Or do you have this 80-20 rule built in there, which made, to the degree that only 20% of that population, or a small percentage of that population, is using healthcare? That may play into how much they're going to spend for healthcare services for that population.
Yeah, well, I'll say just quick, we assumed that the states would continue funding that population, and that may not be, a perfect assumption. I would also say those were Medicaid eligibles. So we had 5 million people becoming eligible for Medicaid. Not all of those people will enroll in Medicaid. It's kind of, it's quite possible that only, a relatively small portion of those who are the sickest do.
Okay, last question. This one is related to COBRA subsidies, and I'm going to send it to Heather. Heather, question is twofold. One is, wouldn't the individual markets just soak up people and provide them subsidies there? So sort of, why do we need COBRA subsidies, I think, is the way the question would be put. And then the second half of this question is, given that this appears to be a useful tool in states like Florida and Texas that have not expanded Medicaid, do you see that Republican legislators, particularly in the Senate, are growing more receptive to the idea of COBRA subsidies?
Yeah, really good questions. And I think, the answer is yes, COBRA is a really imperfect tool. One of the benefits of COBRA, though, is Congress knows how to do it. We have a pattern for subsidizing COBRA, which makes it more doable than some of the other ideas, like just creating new systems, whether that system is allowing people, to buy into Medicaid or Medicare, or whether that idea is providing pandemic accounts. It's very difficult to create an entire new healthcare system in the middle of a pandemic. And so sort of feasibility is a leading reason. I think the other reason is that for consumers, one of the top things we've seen is that most Americans have already paid their deductibles by May 19th is the new deductible date. And for Americans who are in exchange coverage, that means starting over with a really significant deductible, right? You might be going from $1,000 deductible that you've already paid to a new $6,000 deductible in the exchange. Even if your premium is paid for, you are now in a 70% actuarial plan, and you have to start over your deductible at a point where you don't have a lot of flexible income. It can still really be a financial challenge for families moving into exchange coverage. And so as we look at some of the other policy ideas that are on the table that would not do as much to preserve the important role, it's a little bit of employers doing their part in this crisis in order to demonstrate that we are a permanent and important part of the healthcare solution in this country versus the alternatives that were proposed by Congress. COBRA's there. On the employer, on the support from Republicans, we actually have seen a lot of growth. Republicans are still very concerned about public the role of the ACA and, being out front on requesting its expansion. And so that's a really politically challenging argument to make in some of these states still, whereas supporting private market coverage, one, is just much more popular with voters. Yep. And two, it's much more politically feasible. And so in a state where you haven't expanded Medicaid and you don't want to be arguing for an expansion of the ACA, this is really the only feasible policy option you've got on your plate.
You got it. Okay, thanks everybody. Lori, I'm going to throw back to you for to close us off.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. What a great panel. I'd like to thank our panel for sharing their insights with us today. Don't worry if you were unable to take notes or want to share some of the findings with a colleague. EBRI will be sending out a recording of this webinar along with a slide deck and an evaluation form for this session. We would love to receive your feedback, so please do take a few moments to complete the evaluation. I also want to remind you about tomorrow's webinar and our final policy forum session entitled Financial Wellness in Times of Crisis. Many workers are struggling as they face the current crisis. We heard about it today, we'll hear about it tomorrow. How are plan sponsors, providers, and policymakers addressing the current need? Our distinguished panelists will share their thoughts. I also want to highlight a variety of webinars EBRI is offering over the summer. Many more will be added to the fall, so be sure to visit ebri.org. EBRI also hopes to hold its next policy forum in our traditional in-person format in December, so stay tuned for more information. On behalf of EBRI, I want to thank you for spending your time with us today, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.